Hello all, this is NaveenPrabhu. Today we are going to look at the game between Magnus Carlsen and Vidit Gujrathi. This is also from the round 11 of the Tata Steel 2022 Masters. Here Magnus goes for an e4 move. He usually plays something like d4 or c4, that is the queen's pawn opening or the English opening here. But surprisingly, he chooses to place the move e4 here, and Vidit goes for the e5. And to his surprise, now Magnus goes for a bishop to c4. That is, he's playing the bishop's opening in this match. That is, usually masters will continue something like in the Italian setup, like placing the knight on f3 and followed by the bishop. First, he goes for a bishop to c4. The idea of the opening is to just advance the d pawn and develop our knight, and just push the f4 pawn and delaying the development of the knight to f3. And only after the f4 push we will just develop our knight and looks for some castling ideas. In the game, he goes for this sort of ideas. Now he replaces back with the move knight to f6, and he goes for d3, and he replaces back with the move knight to c6, and he didn't go for something like f4 ideas. He wants to place the position in the Italian way, so he goes for knight to f3 here, and he develops his bishop here. Pretty much the setup of the Italian here. He develops the queenside knight, and he stops the bishop coming to g5 with the move h6 here. He does the same. If ever the d6 move happens, he just want to stop the knight bishop coming to g4 here. And here he pushes a6 and want to advance the b5 pawn on the queen side. It may be useful here. He wants to stop that advancement, so he plays the move a4, and now he pushes the pawn to d6, now asking for a trade here. Here he just trades here, and the pawn captures back. And as you see in the master database, only 4 positions has been reached before in the exact same way. Here he goes for a bishop to e6, and he didn't capture the bishop, he just supported the bishop. If he does, he will also get the open file here. If bishop captures, the pawn captures, then after castle the rook will get an open file. Now we only having the open file, so he didn't capture with that. And here he just castles here, and here the white does the same, and he pushes the pawn to d5, want to extend some pieces on the center. So this position has not been reached before. This is the new move of the game here. Actually, when the position reached before, that is, when the position has been reached before, there are only knight to a5 or knight to e7 has been played in the position. Now d5 has been played by Vidit Gujrathi. This is the new move of the game. Here he just trades, and series of trades happen here. After the knight captures, the queen guards the knight trades here, and the queen captures the knight, and the queen comes to d6 and waiting for the trade of bishops here. The knight guards the bishop here, and he pushed the f5 pawn. Now Magnus just trades the bishop, and after the queen captures, asking for a queen trade. We can't decline the trade by moving the queen anyway, because it will just opens the check on the king here. So he just trades here, and he didn't capture with his knight. He didn't mind troubling the pawns here, because he will just get open b file in the situation. So he captured with the c pawn here. Now you want to undermine the center by pushing the pawn to e4. He just pushes the pawn forward. He wants to undermine the center, so he pushes the pawn to f4. Now he captures with this rook. The rook captures and the pawn captures, and the knight captures this pawn. We capture the e4 pawn, and the knight can capture the c2 pawn and attack the rook here. but he didn't want to capture the c pawns here, because as you see the c pawns is already weak because it is a double pawn, so we didn't want to capture the c2 pawn and waste our time here. So he goes for another pawn by giving the check, and after the king moves he captured the f4 pawn. Now Magnus puts his rook on the b1 and attacks the pawn on b7, so he pushes the pawn forward. As I already told you, the c pawns are already weak, so you want to give up the pawn and want the black to have the double the c pawn. So he tries pushing the pawn forward, but Vidit didn't capture it. He puts his rook aligned with the white king here, and can also move the knight and give a discovery in this way. Here he just captures the pawn, and after the pawn captures, interestingly, we can't just push the pawn forward, because if it does after the captures, the rook will just captures, and it is also okay to place the move as a pawn down, because as I told you the c pawns are weak, that is a double c pawn, so it is also playable. But here he just goes for a rook to f8, and the pawn captures the b6, and he captures back. And note the point that rook can't capture the pawn here because it's a blunder here. We can just give him this check, and you have to give the knight, and we will just exchange the pieces, and we will be a knight up. There is no enough compensation for white to continue this game here. So he knows that, so he pushes the pawn to c4, and now he gives him this check. The king comes to e2. Now we place the rook to e8. This was not that accurate move, because it actually, you see, after it captures the knight, you can always pick up the knight on e4, but this pawn has no pawn to stop it from queening, because you don't have the c or e pawn to stop the d pawn. But before the pawn is on c file, it is just stopped by the b pawn here. So it is well and good to play the move knight to f6 and attack the knight. If the knight is captured, we can just capture with the rook and guard our b pawn here, or we can just continue the game. After the knight comes, we can just guard in this way. It is playable, but here he goes for a knight to d5, rook to e8. That is not at all good. After captures, we will capture the knight. As you see, the engine advantage is showing a plus 1.1 here for white. After the king comes here and the rook have to move somewhere, the better move was to put a rook on f4 and go back and stop the pawn here. But he goes and captures the pawn, which is very difficult to stop the d pawn from queening, because after the king comes, we need to cut this diagonal. So he puts the rook on e1 and cuts the diagonal in this way. He puts the rook on a5, wants to give him this check and pick up the d pawn. We can't just casually push the pawn to d7. If so, he will just give the check and pick up the d pawn here. So the king comes forward to avoid the check. Now the rook goes back and waiting for the pawn push. If does, he can just deliver this check. He knows that he goes forward. He goes forward here, and he just gives him the check. And the king goes to c6, and Vidit just started pushing the b pawns here. Now, actually in the game, Magnus goes for d7. This is not an accurate move in this game, because it actually loses the advantage for Magnus. According to supercomputer, it's telling that the move Magnus have to play is rook to e7, because after the king comes to f6, we can just want to play the waiting move in this situation, that is rook to e4, which cuts this diagonal here, which cuts the pawn from forwarding in the situation. And we can also consider forwarding our own best pawn here, that is after our check we can just move away and come behind our pawn. and after he picks up, we can have to put our rooks behind the pawn because you can't just start pushing the pawn, which makes somewhat difficult to win the game in this situation because the rook will just trade for the pawn. If you put a rook against the pawn in this way, there is the rook can't able to reach out our pawn. It is so much winning for white in this situation. But the game can be continued like this. After we push, you may get some troubles here. We will just win the game in this way. But in the game, he just pushes the d7. It is not at all winning for white here. He thought that this is winning, but it is not at all winning. Because now he can give him this check, and after the king moves, can start attacking. And we want to force the king to place on the d8 square so that it blocks the d7 square. And we'll just start pushing his b pawn here. And now Magnus gives him this check. The king should goes to f8. Note that the king can't come to g6. It is winning for white here because he can just place the king on e8 and threatening the queen on next move, which is winning for white here. So the king have to stay on the f7 and f8 squares. So he goes for rook to e3 and stops the b3 pawn. Now the king comes to f7, just trying to move his king in this way, and he gives him another check. The king goes back, and he has placed the rook on e5 and having a final try on the black king here. That is, you can't simply place the move like b3 and advance your own best pawn, because here you can just deliver this check, and after the king goes in, we can just put our king here, and we are going to push our pawn to queen here, because you can't have this check. After this check we will come here, and after deliver this check we can even block and threatening our pawn to queen on the next move. It is not good for black here. So the best move in the situation is to avoid the rook check on f5. So we have to push our pawn to g6 to avoid it, and the rook will attack the g6 pawns. We can just start pushing our best pawns here. The rook can just start picking up the pawns, but here he just gives him the check, and after the king comes here, he wants to put his king here, and after we give him this check, he avoids the check by the rook here, and the trade happens. We just start pushing the best pawn. Magnus queens it, and here Vidit queens it. And note the point, the black queen is just guarding the g6 pawn here. That is the important part in this game, because you can't able to do without something getting on the king side, because you can only give him check. You can't able to pick up any materials on the king side. After a series of checks, they both agree to a draw in this way. That is, after the queen to c7 check, the king goes and king comes here, and they agree to a draw on move number 51. I hope you guys enjoy this video. Hit the like button and keep supporting this channel, and see you in the next video. This is NaveenPrabhu signing off.